North Africa in World War II, with its vast deserts and land, was the scene of much fighting. The distance from Casablanca to Cairo is almost 2,300 miles, or almost 3,700 kilometers. One of the more notable weather conditions that affects the North African desert is known by many names, but two of them are El Ghibli or Kamsina. This is a powerful, hot, and dusty wind that descends from the interior highlands of Libya toward the Mediterranean Sea. When the storm passes over an area, it can last for several hours or days. The storm carries great quantities of sand and dust from the deserts, with speeds up to 87 miles per hour or 140 kilometers per hour, and the humidity in that area drops below 5%. Even in winter, sandstorms can cause temperatures to rise above 113 degrees Fahrenheit or 45 degrees Celsius. It could occur at any time throughout the year, but is most frequent during the spring and early summer. Even though they are used to it, this annual series of sandstorms makes North African natives miserable. It's easy to see how this would affect combat operations on both sides in World War II. Most Europeans, who were new to the desert, usually underestimated the power and duration of these storms at first. Not all blowing sand would end up being a real storm, but the potential of a big storm to the soldier on the ground was always there in his mind. Once the severe Ghibli started, then all flight operations had to cease, or they risked crashing, as visibility would go to zero. This could be a blessing or a curse, depending on what your army was doing at the moment. When the Allies had started to gain the upper hand in the air war over North Africa, it was wonderful for the Germans to have no British fighters attacking them from the sky. However, this same storm would severely slow the progress of the Axis army and their supply trucks. A typical description of trying to drive a vehicle in such a tremendous force of a storm would go like this. The air shimmered and a sandstorm began to blow up. Soon the visibility, which had so far been good, closed right down. Immense clouds of reddish dust obscured all visibility and forced our car speed down to a crawl. Often the wind was so strong that it was impossible to drive along the road. Sand flowed over the windshield like water. We gasped in breath painfully through handkerchiefs, held over our faces, and sweat poured off our bodies in the unbearable heat. This explains why many pictures from the North African campaign show soldiers on both sides with goggles and handkerchief coverings, attempting to block the swirling sand. You didn't need a storm for the sand and dust to bother you, you just needed to drive in a column that kicked up a massive amount of debris into the air. Many times vehicles were forced to stop for a while. If they insisted on driving through it, then they would have no visibility and had to use a compass to know which direction they were going. One account stated that, after leaving their vehicle, the soldiers had to grab onto a telegraph wire and slowly grope along in the blinding sandstorm, just to ensure that they wouldn't get lost and were going in the right direction. Perhaps soldiers on both sides didn't initially know this, but using a compass to drive by, even in a blinding sandstorm, was probably not a good idea. Several times in the North African campaign, Allied and German troops were forced to halt fighting mid-battle because of the sandstorms. The grains of sand, whirled by the wind, blinded the soldiers and fouled equipment. In a day of driving sand, artillery could be fired, but not aimed with any accuracy. The shells could also be affected by gusts of wind. There were also many battlefield advantages that sandstorms brought. For example, if you were moving during a sandstorm, the movements would likely not be observed by the enemy. However, because of the slow pace, it usually ate up a massive amount of fuel, which was always in short supply in the desert. Also, if a commander coordinated it correctly, or if he just got lucky, he could use a sandstorm to cover his advance and pick off enemy tanks one by one. The 21st Panzer Division destroyed 120 British tanks using this tactic on either June 12 or 13, 1942, at the Battle of Gazala. There was also the possibility of crashing into other friendly vehicles. One of the interesting things about fighting in the flat terrain of the desert is that usually you can see for many miles in the distance, because there aren't any buildings obstructing such a view. Also, Another interesting fact is that when an army travels across the sand, you can easily track them if it was a recent movement. You might also be able to get an idea of whether there were any tanks with them and the direction they were going. However, one of the downsides, if you wanted to track the opposing army, would be a sandstorm, which would blow away any trace of earlier tracks. Because of the temporary cover they provided, sandstorms made it easier to clear lanes through the minefields. British Field Marshal Montgomery and the 8th Army also used a sandstorm to their advantage. In the Second Battle of El Alamein on November 5, 1942, a large column of about 400 Allied tanks and armored troop carriers pressed hard on the German and Italian rear guards. When the sandstorm cleared, Field Marshal Rommel realized that the British had outflanked him in the south. Rommel knew that he had to sound the retreat before everything was lost. During Napoleon's 1798 Egyptian campaign, the French soldiers had a hard time with the Compsognas. When the storm appeared as a bloody tent in the distant sky, the Ottomans went to take cover, while the French did not react until it was too late, then choked and fainted in the blinding, suffocating walls of dust. So, it wasn't just the extreme heat, the scorching sun, the lack of water, and the smell of camels that World War II soldiers had to deal with, but there was also the desert sandstorm that came and went as it pleased. If you liked the video you just watched, then you may like these 2 other videos from EmersusTech.